So all of this was fitting in with the things I had already learned and had thought deeply about. And now here's this guy telling me, well, these numbers are at the basis of an ancient technology. And I said, I knew it. I knew it. Yep. Hi, Susan.
Hi, Randall. Welcome. So good to see you.
It was good to see you.
Yes.
I bet you I think it's better to see you than you seeing me.
I don't know about that.
Well,
so you're in town for a conference, and
I'm here for the Hereticon conference over at the Fianna Hotel. My
Nice.
God, what a fancy place.
Is it?
But I got a 7th floor window looking right out over the ocean, so hey,
Beautiful.
what can I say?
Beautiful.
Yeah, but actually I like being here with you guys.
Yes, we like you here.
Okay.
So we're here talking about the thunderstorm generator.
Ah, yes.
Malcolm and Malcolm Bendel, of course.
Of course.
Near and dear to our hearts. Mm-hmm. So we just want to get your take and how you fit. First of all, how you fit into the picture, maybe how you met Malcolm, and how your experience in sacred geometry has fit into this.
I was into sacred geometry long before I met Malcolm. Mm-hmm. But in my studies, I was reaching for meaning within what I was studying. And I knew it was going somewhere, but where exactly I didn't know. And I knew it had something to do with, like what Sheila was talking about, harmonic resonance. And I, in a very vague way, envisioned that it had to have been some kind of a system of energy control or manipulation, generation, and that was what my instincts told me. And then I began to learn things that led me to more specifically conclude that yes, this is where it seems to be going. Mm-hmm. And then one day, I can actually remember the first call. There's a large farmer's market near where I live. Mm-hmm. I was going over there to get some food, whatever. I don't remember what I was buying that day. But I get a call in the parking lot, and I'm thinking, yeah, I'm in a hurry, I got a lot to do. But I went ahead and answered it. I didn't recognize the number, and I answered it, and it's this man with a, I don't know, Australian accent, Tasmanian accent, I'm not quite sure. And he started just launched in talking about all kinds of stuff, and I'm, okay. And then the gist of it was this, that he had seen a video of a lecture that I gave that Brad Young recorded and posted on his series Geocosmic Rex, and he had seen that. And I don't remember, don't know how he got a hold of my contact information, but somehow he did. So he calls me and then to tell me that he had seen that and that he was working on this energy technology that used resonance and frequencies, and it was all based on numbers, and they were the same numbers that I was talking about in this lecture.
Wow.
So I thought, oh, that's very interesting. But then he launched into I sat out there in the parking lot probably for an hour. At the end of it, I'm going, okay, what do I make of all this that I just heard? So this had to have been, 8 or 9 or even 10 years ago.
Okay.
Well, then, a little time goes by, a few months, and I get another call from Malcolm, and then this sort of became a regular routine that I would get a call from him every 3-4 months to tell me all these new discoveries he's made. He tells me about his laboratory that he's built on his island in the Maldives, and it sounded pretty interesting, but I wasn't sure, should I be believing all of this? And then, of course, he went into some pretty wild stories, background stories, and I was, okay, well, I don't know quite what to make of all of this, but I did notice this, and I've mentioned this before, that when you're listening to somebody, if somebody, gives you a bunch of BS, typically you can listen to what they say, and then if you talk to them 6 months or a year later, it's not quite the same story.
Yeah.
The details get rearranged. What I noticed with Malcolm, and I started actually after a couple of phone calls from him, I started taking notes. And what I noticed was the details were always the same. They didn't vary. So he tells me a wild story, and then a year later, he tells me the same story again, and it's exactly the same story. So I started thinking, okay, maybe there's more credibility to this. And so it got to then what eventually evolved was that, I told him that I was doing these podcasts. I was doing a lot of podcasts and stuff. So then he tells me that now his notes that he had been working on were all compiled and kind of organized, and that's when he began to tell me that he wanted to open source all of the stuff he'd put together, that he was building they had built a prototype. And then I think he sent me some video clips. I think the first one that he sent me was a video clip with Roland Perry and two of the mechanics that had done a retrofit for not a Fairlane, what was it?
Futura.
A Futura. Yeah. And then Jordan, who was interviewed earlier, right?
Yes, he was.
You went and followed up on that 5 years later, right? And so that kind of really instilled in me much more confidence that, okay, this is real. This is not just something theoretical. Because doing what I've done, I've had a lot of people come to me with their ideas and things that after looking into them, I'm like, I don't know. But and that's as I learned more and got into it. But with Malcolm, the more I learned and got into it, the more plausible it all seemed.
Got it.
Well, I'm just going to skip ahead. Basically, what happened was he told me that I could, about the idea of open sourcing it, because he didn't want it to ever get bottled up again. And I was totally on board with that. Yeah, whatever I can do, And by that time, I had studied enough sort of alternative energy systems to see that there were parallels to things that other people were doing. Even though I wasn't going to consider myself knowledgeable or an expert, I could definitely begin to see the parallels. So anyways, he wants to do an open sourcing, and I said, yeah, man, whatever we can do to get it out there. And then, that's how we'll test it and prove its viability and all of that, because if you put it out there, other people can try to replicate it, which is the key to scientific verification, replication. So I went on Joe Rogan in November of 2022 with Graham Hancock. And Graham, I think that was my third time on Rogan with Graham. And he invited me to join him. And I said, I'd be happy to, yeah. So just before we go on into the studio for the interview, Graham says, let's try to stay away from the ancient technology thing, because we often get bogged down into that, and that was kind of an Achilles heel. People, the archaeological establishment, as soon as you start talking about, ancient science, ancient technology, they're ready to just close ranks and try to shut you down.
Wow.
So I said, sure, whatever, I'm your guest, or whatever you want is fine with me. So we go in there and we're discussing, we're having a great conversation, and it comes around to ancient technology. Well, I think it was around the idea of, the megalithic stones, and Joe was like, how did they do this? I mean, 20 and 50 ton stones and so on, and he's talking to Graham about this, and then Graham looks at me, and I'm like, well, wait a minute, I thought you said that, And so I knew that Malcolm had given me what I thought was like the green light to just disclose. He says Malcolm had said, yeah, it's time for disclosure. We want to get all of this out there. And I didn't know to where the demarcation line was going to be. So I just said, well, yeah, there's this, I've been talking to this inventor who's come up with something, and it's very interesting. It's based on plasma technology, and I kind of went into some of the details. I mentioned it was Malcolm, and said, he's been kind of in a recluse for the last 8 years on an island and in a laboratory that he built, and he's been experimenting, and he's built some prototypes. And I gave away a little bit more information than I guess Malcolm was expecting me to do. And if I'm recalling right, Malcolm said he wasn't even back on his island. He was out on a boat somewhere. And when he heard that I had sort of mentioned his name and the location and all of that, and I even mentioned that to try to establish some credibility here, I mentioned that there was possibly negotiations with, and not knowing that there was some NDAs, and I mean, I was just, hey, I was innocent. I didn't know. I thought that this is what Malcolm wanted, you know, but
Disclosure.
so I just spilled the beans, and shortly after that, I get a call from Fox News. And it was basically they're calling because Tucker Carlson wanted to do an interview for his daytime show. And at the time, he was down in Boca Grande, and I thought, cool, I'll go down and have a conversation with Tucker. Absolutely. So I did. I went down there, and Fox News put me up in a hotel there on the island, and I get to the hotel, and there's Malcolm. So he had out at sea somewhere and didn't even go back to his island. He immediately came to America.
Wow.
So then he went with me to Tucker Carlson's studio. So if you ever look up and see the interview, you don't see him, but Malcolm was in the studio standing. And I told Malcolm, I said, look, don't say a word, just listen, okay? Don't say anything during the interview. Don't like jump in and, you know, I said, this is not my show here. This is something else. So he said he promised that he wouldn't say anything and that he would just be a fly on the wall. And he was, until it was over. Then once it was over and we quit recording, he jumped in there, and I have a great picture. I don't have it readily handy on my picture, but it's me and Malcolm and Tucker, you know, in his studio there. And so then it turns out that, you know, I was going to head back to Atlanta, and Malcolm stayed there on the island. He said to me, this reminds me of my island back in the Maldives, and I really like it here. And so he went and rented a room at a resort. I went up to visit him, and it turned out that I don't know if he was the owner or the manager of the resort, anyways, he was a fan of mine.
Wow.
So he got really into what we were doing. Malcolm I had to go back home to Atlanta, but Malcolm stayed there for about a month. I think I stayed on for maybe an extra 3, 4, 5 days. But so the manager of the resort there, they had a restaurant that had shut down because of COVID. And so he gave us the keys to it, said, you guys take it over. So we turned it into a recording studio.
Wow. And how long were you there?
Malcolm was there a whole month.
Wow.
I was there 3 or 4 or 5 days. Like
So that was the beginnings of you and Malcolm publicly kind of coming together in the public's eyes as to sort of collaborating in this incredible.
Yes, and I want to add one more chapter to it, is that after he'd been there about a month, he leaves, he comes up to Atlanta, and myself, Mike Robertson, my partner in HowTube.com, and Brad Young, we spent 3 to 4 weeks working with Malcolm, putting together a whole slideshow about the work, and then Brad and Mike recorded Malcolm doing like 10 hours of lectures as they went through the slides.
Wow.
So I think he's been using that. Good to know. Then we go back. So anyways, I get this. When I'd been on the Rogan show with Graham, after we're done, Joe comes up to me and says, hey, would you be willing to come back just to talk about the energy? And I said, sure. And I thought, you know, this is November, I guess, and then this was going to be in February, I think. So I've got a few months I can try to, you know, get a better handle on it so I can actually speak like I kind of halfway know what I'm talking about. Well, so then it came time to go out to Austin. Joe has moved from LA to Austin. So it was myself, Brad Young, George Howard, Cosmic Summit George Howard, Mammoth Tusk George Howard, and Malcolm and a young fellow that was kind of like my assistant. So we all drive out there, and in the morning I called Joe and I said, you know, it just so happens I have the inventor with me. So can I bring him on? Joe says, sure. So we get there, myself, Malcolm, we go into Joe's studio. Now in the interim, what's happened is that Joe's producer there and tech man, Jamie, has gone online and he's found all of this backstory stuff where the different oil companies were trying to discredit him and scare away investors, and they had concocted this whole thing about him. And Jamie had pulled up some of that stuff. So when we walk in to sit down, Joe was sitting there at his studio desk reading that stuff. So he's taking that like that's the story. This is who Randall's brought in, this grifter. That's pretty much what Joe was. So what I got later was that, you know, Joe thought, oh, he's got to protect Randall from this guy.
I see.
So
I see.
it immediately started in. Didn't take long to get contentious because, I mean, we all know Malcolm. He's not going to sit passively while he's being attacked or you know, being criticized. Yeah. So when it was, as this is going on though, I'm like, oh my God, this is not the direction I thought this was going to go. I had that whole slideshow we had done. So I'm wanting to go through the slides and it, you know, if it ever sees the light of day, you'll see that I'm constantly trying to steer the conversation away from the conspiracies and the politics and the contention and get back. Let's talk about the science here. And it was very frustrating for me. And by the time it's over, it's like, okay, now what, 20 million people, 30 million people are going to think Randall is, you know, brought this confidence man in. And, you know, I was already anticipating the blowback from it and wondering how it was going to be affecting me and kind of like, well, okay, I guess I'll just ride with it and see what happens. So we adjourn, we're done, everybody's walking out, and Joe kind of, yeah, what is it? And he goes, would it be okay with you if I just sat on this for a while? And I was like, yeah, sit on it as long as you want. So it still, to this day, has not been ever aired, which is fine with me until it gets to the point where it's not ambiguous anymore. It's completely settled. This is real. Okay? At that point, I want it to go back out. I want it to go.
Do you think we're close to that now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Way closer than we were a couple of years ago, thanks to people like Bob and Jordan and some others.
Sheila?
Maybe in a small way I've contributed to that, but
I think quite big way. And if we can maybe move on to how your studies in sacred geometry, I mean, we've heard from Sheila and Jordan and Bob, and you know, the running theme of course is the geometry, the numbers and the geometry, which basically are, the numbers are the geometry and vice versa, right? So,
well, I could zip through here to some of this. So this is, I think, maybe where it overlaps a lot with what Sheila's doing.
Okay, and the actual construction of the thunderstorm itself.
Well, yes. I mean, the 4-3-2 ratio was something that I had been working with and finding in all of these various places. I bet you, I'm sure that Bob has probably seen the work of Ernest G. McLean. No, okay. This is something for you to check out. Anyways, a vibrating string of any reference length can be halved to sound the octave higher or double to sound the octave lower. Since all tones recur cyclically at the octave, the same tone, and that's a reference to Plato, the same in the other, the same in the different, in one sense, but a different tone in another. Again, that's your octave, because it's the same tone in one sense, but a different tone in the other sense. And it's all based upon vibration, right? So any octave can serve as a model for all possible octaves, at least for the general purposes of tuning theory. The cyclic structure of the octave is the invariant common to all systems of tuning. So this idea of invariance always intrigued me. And just before we started this recording, I showed you an example of invariance from the geological realm, which is where I had first encountered the idea, although it wasn't, the term invariant wasn't used. I came across that term, in mathematical, when I was learning about fractals and, fractal self-similarity and that kind of thing. But I was simultaneously, studying geology. And so if you ever open a geology text and you're looking at a photograph of a geological formation, let's say an outcrop, usually you'll see something in that photograph that's there for scale. Oftentimes, if it's larger, you'll put a person in there for scale.
Right.
Or you put typically the rock pick is what was used in a lot of the old, set your rock pick, or you might actually take a meter stick or anything so somebody can get the scale, because you might be looking at something, you're going, okay, am I looking at something that's 6 feet high or 600 feet high?
Right.
And that's why you have to have that. So I was studying math and studying like how these principles were used in design, in art and architecture and so on. And one of the principles I came across was that in sacred structures, this fractal self-similarity seemed to be a sort of a dominant feature of the concept or the design, in that there was a very precise and specific relationship between the part and the whole structure. So there was this unity of the whole structure, and within that was the part, the element, the component, but by having the same geometric ratios, and the ratios here were the keys, it would vibrate in a sense that it complemented the vibration of the entire structure. See? So I had encountered this in sacred architecture, sacred art, and then in geology. So that became just an idea that was extremely fascinating to me. And then I started looking into the origin of these numbers, and I don't think we've got time to get into all of it today. But then, as I got into it, I realized that these numbers applied not only to the measurement of space, like you would look at in a building or a painting, but to the measurement of time as well. And so here's from the myths of pre-Columbian America. Time was equaled with space, and 12 times 30 gave 360 days for the year. Now, this was the sacred year, and I found this fascinating. And so many of the ancient calendars had a sacred year of 360 days. And so there was this discrepancy between the conceptual, the idealized version, and the actual, the materialized, incarnated version. And I saw that, I took that into terms as, made my living primarily as a builder, and we worked from plans, blueprints. And so I knew that, there's like 3 stages here between when you actually see a structure in 3D time and space. It starts with a conception up here, then that translates into a 2D form. I go out on the project, and there we have blueprints. And everything is kind of the idealized projection of what was in the architect's mind is on the blueprints. And there will be numbers in there and dimensions primarily. And then you go out and you build the structure, and depending on the level of craftsmanship of those who built it will determine the degree of deviation between the idealized dimensions and the real structure. Right? And so if you build a building and you are going off dimensions that are on a set of blueprints, and then let's say that building is sat there, let's just say a house is sitting there. 100 years later, you go and you measure it, the house is going to have deviated even from the original dimensions. Just maybe the wind, the decay of materials, seismic movements, whatever, right? So the point is that, number one, the deviation is going to be a measure of the craftsmanship employed. The higher the level of craftsmanship, the smaller the deviation from the ideal. The longer the building has been sitting there or the house has been sitting there, the greater will be the deviation. But the point is this: you've got the ideal blueprint and you've got the actual manifestation in matter, in space, in time. And then I began to understand the larger world, the cosmos, if you want to call it that way, the solar system, is being the same principle. Is that there was a set of proportions and ratios built into tangible creation that manifested both in space and in time. That was a major revelation for me, see. But the fact that I had done the building work, it kind of provided me a metaphor to think about this. So I began looking at the dimensions and proportions of space and time and discovered some very interesting things. That when you go into geometry, let's take the 5 regular polyhedra, also known as the Platonic solids, they can generate a series of numbers. Now Malcolm has said, well, to get the harmonic frequency of any geometric form, take the sum of the interior angles. And I had already done that. And so I had come up with these numbers: the tetrahedron, 720, the cube, 2,160. And by the way, all of these numbers are going to show up on Malcolm's the PUM, plasma unification model, exactly. And 1440, which is, you know, that's a repetitive number. We find it in the Bible, not necessarily as 1440, but as 144, as 144,000. And as Malcolm says, the number of zeros isn't the critical thing, right? So all of this was fitting in with the things I had already learned and had thought deeply about. And now here's this guy telling me, well, these numbers are at the basis of an ancient technology. And I said, I knew it. I knew it. Yep. So
Incredible.
The dodecahedron. And then, see, in my geological studies, let me jump forward.
Okay.
Well, I found these numbers everywhere. It just like time measure in our day. I think Sheila was talking about this earlier, right? 24 hours in a day. 24 hours is 1,440 minutes.
Wow.
1,440 minutes is 86,400 seconds. And if you take 12 hours, that's 720 minutes, 43,200 seconds. So now you get this repetition. And I thought this was really interesting because way back in the early 70s, I started studying Middle Eastern philosophy, and I read a lot of the Vedas. And in the Vedas, these numbers show up. For example, the measure of the Yuga time cycles, these vast time cycles, the kalpas, the day and night of Brahma. And here were these numbers, right, recurring redundantly in these various, and then they show up in the Sumerian king lists. They show up in Mayan traditions. They show up in the numbers that measure our solar system, the Earth, the moon. I jump back to this here, and yeah, the cube, 2,160 degrees. Well, the moon is very, very close to 2,160 miles. A little bit of deviation, but again, in my mind, it's like, okay, but that doesn't matter because, and some of the critics, they say, well, it's actually 2,161 miles, or the sun is actually 865,000. Well, I say, well, if you include the chromosphere, yeah, but when we measure the Earth, do we include the atmosphere, or do we measure the solid Earth? Right, so, but again, it led me back to this idea of, well, okay, so we're looking at manifestation, we're looking at the incarnation of matter and energy and time and space. But that replication, of course, is going to have a slight deviation from the idealized template of creation.
Certainly.
Right?
Yeah.
So it seemed like the critics just couldn't quite get that. Anyways, so properties of the regular polyhedra. So you can see some of the numbers here. Look at this. 1 square yard, 1,296 inches. Well, put a 0 after that, now you've got half the precessional cycle. Interestingly, by the mid-90s, I had been correlating, let's see if I can pull this up here. Let's see. I've been correlating events in Earth history with these numbers and these time cycles. I should have it. And what I discovered was that when you looked at the events in Earth history, now what I did when I say events, I'm looking for at these nonlinear, I call them nonlinear events, that when we've created a civilization in the 11,600 years of the Holocene, which has been relatively stable compared to what came before. Because what came before was extreme relative to what we've experienced in the last 10,000 years, which I then would suggest that we have had an interval of relatively stable climate and environmental change that has allowed us to create the infrastructure of civilization. Okay?
Makes sense.
And that in times past, there was a very different set of circumstances. I may have one. Okay, so let's look at this. So this is a wheel of time. Bob likes to say wheels within wheels, and that's a perfect description. It's like right out of the visions of the prophet Ezekiel from the Old Testament, who describes wheels within wheels. And Bob is showing all of this phenomena, micro and macro phenomena, wheels within wheels. And I had kind of come up with the same idea, except in temporal cycles, time cycles, and saw that it seemed like the larger cycles of change encompassed lesser cycles, which in turn encompassed lesser cycles, and they were all related by these harmonic relationships, these ratios that showed up in these numbers over and over again. So what I did here is, this is just the 12 signs of the zodiac. What you see here, we'll call this the present, 0 years before present, and one full cycle would be 25,920 years before present. So as we go back through, now this is based upon what I think of as the cosmic clock, which is the vernal equinox. And the vernal equinox was used by ancient cultures to measure cosmic time. So if you look at this, this is Aries, Pisces, Aquarius, Capricorn, Sagittarius, Scorpio, and so on. Okay, if we go back through each of these 12 signs, we start here and we go back through 1 quarter, and we get to 6,480 years before present. Well, 6,480 is the internal number of degrees in the dodecahedron. See, 43,200 years BP.
There we go.
Well, the next thing, like I say right down here, idealized numbers of the precessional cycle. Down here we see half the cycle when the vernal equinox was transiting from Virgo into Leo, 12,960. Well, what happened? Very close, typically one century within 12,960 years ago. Do you know?
I don't, off the top of my head.
It's an event, again, what I call an event, happened that is called the Younger Dryas. And it could be the most significant climatic event in Earth history, perhaps going back 3 to 5 million years. If we use as our yardstick the loss of species, and the loss of species then is a measure of the loss of habitat, well, we could then say that there was an extreme event that happened around 12,900 years ago, and this event caused the mass extinction of half of all species on Earth that weighed more than 100 pounds in body weight, about 44 kilograms. In the hotel where I'm staying, there's a big, like, bronzed model. I think it's fake, I don't think it's real, but it's a full-size skeleton of a woolly mammoth that they've got encased in glass. Maybe it is real. I'm gonna have to ask somebody and find out. But of course, and the reason they have that is because there was a lot of woolly mammoths here up until this date right here, basically. Plus a lot of other extinct species that you no longer find around here. And those are the megafauna. And the megafauna, half of the planet's megafauna went extinct around 12,900 years ago.
And we have that being half the 25,000.
Half. And interestingly, I had gone back and I had read several times a book called Hamlet's Mill, came out in 1969, where the authors, Georgia de Santillana and Hertha von Deschend, were theorizing that the ancient cultures had been tracking precessional motion for thousands of years before it was presumably discovered by Hipparchus in maybe 600 BC. Somewhere, a Greek mathematician, philosopher, who's given credit for it. And they're arguing in this very dense scholarly work that he was not the originator of it. He was possibly rediscovered it, but it actually went back much, much earlier. And they made the direct connection between the belief of these ancient cultures in the rise and catastrophic fall of civilizations. And the tempo of this was determined by this cycle that you're seeing right here. Now, one of the things that I then did subsequently, reading through hundreds and hundreds of papers, scientific papers that had to do with changes in the climate and the environment through Earth history, at least within the last few 100,000 years, which was the extent of the dating methods that I was looking at. Radiocarbon dating will take you back to about 50,000 years, and you have thermoluminescence, and you have potassium, argon, and uranium series, and there's a whole bunch of dating, dendrochronology, a whole bunch of different dating methodologies that are used now. So I went through, culling through the literature, finding events. Here was my criteria. If an event like this, let me put it this way. What scale of event would essentially pull the plug on modern civilization? That was the criteria I used.
Okay.
Or if not completely pull the plug on it, put it under extreme stress. That was the criteria I used. So then I came up with a whole bunch of these events, and I arrayed them on this circle here. And what I saw was that there was a high correlation between the transitions between these various epochs and these events. And I also noticed that on this axis of the present to halfway along ago, there was a very significant cluster of events that had occurred. And so you can go through this and you'll see that, like, Heinrich Event 5 happened 21,600 years ago, right? Late glacial maximum. Now, you can see the clustering here. So like 12,960 times 3 gave you Heinrich Event 4. Times 5 gave you Heinrich Event 7a. Now, what's a Heinrich event? Well, a Heinrich event is when you have this gigantic disgorging of massive armadas of ice from the ice sheets that were mantling huge swaths of the northern hemisphere during the ice ages. And it became apparent now through studying the changes of ancient climate, paleoclimatology, glaciology, sea level rises, stratigraphy. All of these sciences were coming together to show that there have been these convulsive episodes in Earth history, and they seem to be on a tempo, and that tempo seems to be very closely related to this cycle that you see right here. So I find that interesting.
Yeah,
now,
so sorry to just sort of kind of reorient here just a little bit.
Let's
for me especially. So with this, with the plasmoid unification model and all of its unbelievable, cohesive, basically pulling together all this data into one unified model, you're also talking about time,
yes,
as well as geometry,
yep,
as well as frequencies. I mean, it's all coming together in this one unified, obviously, unification model.
Right, because all of these numbers that you see right here, they all show up on the plasmoid unification model.
Right.
So I think we're seeing we're seeing scaling factors that can take us from the micro to the macro. I think that's what we're seeing here. And so this is how I came to it, through this kind of stuff that I've been showing you here. And then to find this correlation between what I was doing and Malcolm's discoveries and what others now are verifying independently has been immensely inspiring and gratifying to me, to know that. And see, what this has led me to confirm my belief that yes, there's a much deeper, much more complex story to the history of the human presence on planet Earth than mainstream academia has been willing to recognize.
Absolutely.
And I think we're at the point now where we're about to blow the old paradigms completely out of the water. We're about to blow the gates off their hinges, and we're going to start seeing into that deep past and discover that the history of our species on this planet is way deeper, way more complex, and more incredible and miraculous than we'd ever even begin to imagine within the framework of mainstream academia.
Brilliant.
So I'm excited about it.
Extremely brilliant. My goodness. And I just, gosh, I hate to even add on to that. That was so perfect. But I just find your approach from this sort of macrocosm down, I think really, I find that very fascinating because, like you said, when you're building something, you have time that enters into it, and something changes it, whether it's a earth change or just time itself. And so these little tweaks, and while it's not quite like you were saying, that's not quite the number that, I think you basically just explained it for me. They're going to continue to find these patterns throughout the universe.
One perhaps analogy that might help us to understand this. Anybody, I think we've got a couple of T-shirts here with the golden spiral on it, right?
Yep.
Now, if you look at that spiral, you see it curls in towards the infinitely small, but it never actually gets there.
Yeah.
Likewise, if you go the other way, it gets to the infinitely large.
I see where you're going.
Sometimes that's called the Fibonacci spiral, because it's based on this sequence of numbers called the Fibonacci sequence, and each number in the sequence is the sum of the two that preceded it. And so it would start out 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21, 34, 55, 144, and it goes, 144, and it goes like that. Now, what happens though, if you take the successive ratios of each pair in that, if you take 8 over 5, and then 13 over 8, and then 21 over 13, 34 over 21, etc., and you take the value of that ratio, what you'll see is that it's honing in on the golden number as a limit, but it never gets there. So that's why the golden number, the Fibonacci number, is 1.618033989 forever and ever, never repeats, never terminates. It never gets there. It just keeps getting closer and closer and closer. But I guess my point is that it's kind of the same thing with this concept. If you can take, let's say, the larger the numbers, the larger the numerical integers that whose successive ratios you're calculating, the closer you get to the limit, which is the golden number. We humans, our geometry is very much based upon the golden ratio, right? As it's called. So we can take, for example, our cubit, elbow to fingertip, and in mathematics, it's simply, the simplest way to understand it is a straight line, and you asymmetrically divide that line so that the ratio of the small to the large segment is exactly the same as the large segment to the whole. Now, and you can do that geometrically with mathematic precision, but you cannot do it arithmetically with mathematic precision. All you can do is approximate it closer and closer and closer. Now, if we take our cubit, which is elbow to fingertip, and we want to divide, that's the cubit. Let's say and in my sacred geometry classes, I do this. I have each person put their cubit, their forearm down on their drawing pad, mark the end of their middle finger and their elbow, and then determine there's a space, Susan, if you feel on your wrist, or you can, let me see, I'll find, no, you don't have one. No,
Maybe I'm not
no,
human.
I'm kidding. It's in there somewhere. There it is, right there. There it is. That's the space.
Oh, I feel it, yeah.
Okay, so what that does is it divides your cubit into golden ratio. So from here to here is, let me put, from here, fingertip to here, the space of death dot, is to that space to your elbow, as your elbow is to your whole cubit. And you can actually see it if you hold your hand up in front of your face and look at your joints. You'll see that progression of growth between the digit at the, say, the end of your finger, then the next increment, the next increment here, then the next increment here. So we are built on the geometry of the golden section.
Right.
Now, if you start, and now if you take your cubit and you set it vertically and you enlarge it to your height, what you'll discover is that your navel divides your height in the golden section. It's not in the middle of your body. When you're born as an infant, your navel divides your length, your height, more or less in half. Now you can imagine that if you saw a person walking down the street that had the same proportions as a newborn infant, you would think they looked rather strange, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Basically, as we grow to maturity, we're growing into the golden proportion.
Wow.
But here's the thing. Who gets it exact? There have been studies showing that, you know, there are models and things and that who's like your facial structure. It can be divided up. You can take a golden rectangle where its height to width is in that ratio, and it gives you the framework of your face, right? We all deviate a little bit. Some of us are closer than others. Some people's legs are longer, others are shorter, et cetera, et cetera. But here's the thing. Everybody's going to deviate a little bit, but when you start taking a large sample base and you start measuring lots and lots of people, the more people's data you put in, the closer you get to the golden section as a limit.
Right. Brilliant.
So
to wrap this up, as far as the significance, I mean, obviously you basically have derived your own pathway to validation of Malcolm's technology.
yes,
And
but I want to see it. I want to see it tested, retested. I want to, you know, I've seen it in one circumstance where I've actually seen it operational. I'd like to see it in several more applications. I want it to be completely 100% confirmed, at which point I'm then going to go back on Joe Rogan, and I want to be able to put Rogan in a headlock and say, no, I want to make sure that there is no ambivalence, no ambiguity. There's nothing that he can bring up. Joe, there it is. It's working. And here it is. Bring in that thunderstorm generator, set it on in his desk in his studio, crank it up.
well, this has been amazing, incredible, amazing. Is there anything else you wanted to relay regarding Strike Foundation and Malcolm?
Well, no, other than that, you know, yeah, go to Strike Foundation. Is still a functioning website, right? Learn about it. Watch Jordan Collin. Watch his videos. In fact, that's what I'm doing is I'm recommending, look, if you want to get started in this at ground level, here's the place to start.
Yeah.
Go to Alchemical Science. I probably told that to 100 people. Go to this site and watch this fella's presentations, because he really does a fantastic job of putting it succinctly and summarizing it. And it's a challenge to try to follow Malcolm and understand it. But I think that Jordan does a great idea of kind of of bringing it down and putting it into a form that more people are going to be able to get it. So that's what I would recommend people to do.
Fully agree. Fully agree.
Okay, well, we're on the same
All
page
right.
on that one.
Well, thank you so much, Malcolm. This has been amazing. Malcolm. I
Wait,
told you I'm losing it.
let's be clear. I have more hair than Malcolm. Okay.
Well, let's try that again. Thank you so much, Randall.
Yes.
This has been
Thank you.
truly amazing.
Thank you.
I'm explaining my qubits.
Okay.
Alrighty. Thank you, everyone.